Hello and welcome to another video for GCSE Citizenship Studies. This time we're focusing on devolution. Should say that the video is for the AQA spec, but as I mentioned before, it probably doesn't matter at all. Okay, so let's have a look at this particular topic. It's a little bit complicated, but hopefully this will make it easy to understand, and it's focusing on what devolution is all about. Right, so we're going to begin with a newly elected Prime Minister way back in 1997, Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a Labour politician, so a Labour Prime Minister, and he basically, after being elected, allowed Scotland and Wales to hold referendums um, on the creation of a Scottish Parliament and what was known at the time as the Welsh Assembly. Now, Northern Ireland wasn't included at the time as there was still considerable tension and differences between the Republican and Unionist communities that got, I would say, resolved. I'm not necessarily sure resolved is the right word, but basically that got resolved by something called the Good Friday Agreement. And you might want to look in a little more detail at Northern Ireland and its recent history in terms of the Troubles, etc. And now the other thing that Tony Blair did is he also created 8 regional development agencies for England. They didn't prove to be very popular and soon disappeared. But the devolved Parliament of Scotland and Wales did prove successful and have continued to prove successful. So why did Tony Blair do this? I mean, basically, he thought that it was a good idea for Scotland and Wales to have some powers to make their own decisions. It was an example of what's known as localism. Now, Scotland already had some sort of localised powers, but Wales didn't. In essence, it was basically an attempt to remove some of the decision making process away from London and give it to local people. Now, it may be a little bit complicated. So if you're struggling to understand this, and I don't blame you if you are, imagine you're going to go to university and you're living away from home. Your parents or carers pay your bills and expect you to do what they say, despite the fact that you're now living miles away. Is that fair? Well, one argument may be that it is because they're paying your bills, and one argument is that it isn't. You might be prepared to do some of what you've been asked to do, but it's likely that you'll want to make some of your own decisions in the place where you're living. There are, of course, some problems that arise from this, or some issues. Having been given more freedom, where do you stop? Do you keep on asking for freedoms? The other thing is, what about others who want the same freedom as you but don't yet have it? Will they want to demand the same thing, and will they be entitled to receive it? We'll have a look at those issues in a little bit more detail as we go along. Right, so having been an independent kingdom for nearly 1,000 years, in 1707, an Act of Parliament called the Act of Union united the kingdoms of England and Scotland. That's where we get the United Kingdom from. However, Scotland has always retained a separate sense of identity. And in the UK Parliament, it currently has 59 MPs who can vote on decisions that impact the UK as a whole. Now, as I mentioned, devolution created a separate Scottish Parliament which deals with Scottish issues, and what you mustn't do is you mustn't confuse the two. They're two separate organisations. So let's have a look at the Scottish Parliament in a bit more detail. Basically, it has 129 members or MSPs, and they are separate from MPs in the UK Parliament. They do a different job. They also have a First Minister who happens to be, at this moment in time, Nicola Sturgeon. Now, she's the equivalent of the Prime Minister, but in Scotland. And the Scottish Parliament has powers to make decisions about lots of things, education, law, etc., but it doesn't have the power to make laws about other things which the UK deals with as a whole, so things like the military. So, one of the big questions that has arisen is that the Scottish Nationalist Party have become the dominant party in Scotland. And one of their positions is that there should be a referendum, an independence referendum. Now, the first one took place in 2014, and those who wanted independence were narrowly defeated. But the Scottish National Party have basically asked for another referendum, and it looks like they might get it in the next few years, although that's likely to end up in the courts um, for them to make the decision as to whether or not they are entitled to one. At present, I'll put it down there that of the 129 members of the Scottish Parliament, only 64 are from the Scottish National Party. So, in actual fact, the Scottish National Party doesn't have a majority, and they have to be in coalition with the Green Party, who happen to support an independent Scotland as well. In the UK Parliament, as I mentioned, 59 of the MPs represent Scotland, and 48 are currently members of the SNP. So let's turn to Wales. Scotland has a parliament, and Wales didn't originally had a parliament. It is called a parliament now. It was originally called the Welsh Assembly up to 2020. There are 60 members, and they can make decisions on devolved areas such as health and education. And so, for example, during the COVID pandemic, Wales followed different rules to England. Now, I should say that Wales is slightly different. Its devolved powers aren't as strong as in Scotland, and it doesn't have such a big claim to become independent. There are political parties within the Welsh Assembly, like Plaid Cymru, who would like to see an independent Wales, but at this moment in time, um, the appeal of an independent Wales isn't as great as that as an independent Scotland. Right, so we're going to come to Northern Ireland now. Now, I previously mentioned this, or mentioned this earlier on in the video, that Northern Ireland didn't have the same devolved powers until something called the Good Friday Agreement came along. The Good Friday Agreement, so called because it was signed on Good Friday, was basically an agreement to create a Northern Irish Assembly and give Northern Ireland some devolved powers. Now, that was more difficult to do because there's been a history of division between the Republican and Unionist communities. And as a result of that, the powers of the Assembly have sometimes been suspended, with power coming directly from London. If you're not sure, the Troubles was a period of sectarian violence in which 3,000 people were killed through acts of terrorism or violence between the two communities. Now we turn to England, and England is a bit strange. I mean, a lot of people will argue that anyway, but it's basically a bit complicated. And it's complicated because in England there is no devolution. We don't have an English parliament in the same way as Scotland and Wales do. And as a result of that, we end up with something called the West Lothian question, or English votes for English laws. What that basically means is that Scottish MPs in the UK Parliament, please note here that that is not MSPs, they're different, but Scottish MPs in the UK Parliament can vote on things that only impact English citizens. For example, Scottish MPs can vote on tuition fees for students in England, where you have to pay £9,250 per year for tuition fees. But because education is a devolved matter in Scotland, Scottish students attending a Scottish university pay nothing because that's what's been decided on in the Scottish Parliament. So, a big question here is whether England should also have devolved powers to make its own decisions. One thing that people have even asked for is because of the size of England and the population, we're by far the biggest country in the UK in terms of population, whether we even have regional assemblies for different areas, for example, such as Devon and Cornwall. So there are some big questions that come out of this. In particular, I would say that this last slide that I've shown you on, English votes for English laws is quite complicated, and it might take you a little bit of time to get your head around that. Okay, so I hope that this video has been helpful in at least exploring devolution to a certain extent.